Well, I'd like to welcome everybody back again. Sorry that it's been a little while since the last video. My wife and I had the birth of our daughter, Iona Eponine Dawn Briggs. Happened early in the morning on July 4th, so things have been a little busy of late, but I did definitely want to get back to doing some videos. I think in the last one I had said that this one was going to be about a conversation that my wife and I had had about pregnancy and birth and stuff, and I'm actually going to be postponing that one video because in the meantime, I've kind of come to a conclusion of a video that I think is important to do. So I'm going to be focusing on that one first. And that one has to do with going back to work. Um, After Liam's death, I got 10 days off from work that I was able to use. I took 5 off, and then the other 5, at a recommendation of one of my fellow teachers, I decided to leave those so that over the course of the remainder of the school year, if there was a day that I needed to just not be there because of grieving purposes, I could do that. So I took 5 days, and then the other 5 I kind of spaced throughout the year and used on days where I was particularly having a hard time with the grieving process, which was a good choice because probably the first thing I'd like to say about the grieving process is that it takes a lot of time and it comes when you least expect it. So it's not like you get to those first 2 weeks and then you're good, let's get back to work. There are going to be moments throughout the next months, years, etc., that you're going to get hit and it's going to affect you. Um, I can think of particular one day where I was sitting at work, and this was probably a year and a half after it happened, maybe 2 years. I'm sitting in the classroom, I'm teaching math like I always do. One of the students raised their hand, made a comment about something, and something they had said triggered a memory that I had about Liam. And all of a sudden, the grief just took over. I broke down. I was bawling my eyes out. I think the students thought I was crazy. And I basically had to just say, hey, open up to the book, work on these problems. If you don't know how to do them, work as a group to try to figure them out, and we'll go over them tomorrow. But I'm just not in a position to teach right now. And for the last 20, 30 minutes of class, I was just bawling my eyes out, so forth. And I think at first they thought I was a little crazy, but I had told them before about what had happened with my son and that sometimes things like that happen and so forth. And so it worked out okay. But, like, that's not really something you can do with your job. Um, and it definitely wasn't something as a teacher I wanted to do because the students deserve better than that from me. Like, that was not a good day of teaching. Um, and so, an important part of being able to grieve and overcome this was learning to be able to function normally again and to not have breakdowns that just uh, make you incapable of doing your work, or worse, put you at risk of potentially not keeping your job because you can't do what you have to do there. Um, so I have a suggestion to make. This worked really well for me and my wife. Uh, I don't 100% know it would work for everybody because maybe for some people it wouldn't, but this is kind of the thing that helped me to be able to stay professional with what I did. Um, I noticed that when I would try to ignore what had happened and I try to put it aside and just try to keep going on with my day like normal, inevitably the emotions and the feelings would build up over time. And they'd build and they'd build and they'd build until I'd have a moment where I just have a breakdown, like that one I was talking about in my classroom. That was one of those where I had been ignoring the emotions for so long that it finally just forced its way to the surface. I kind of view it as like uh, one of those baking soda volcanoes, and like if you keep putting the baking soda and the vinegar in, no matter how much you try to hold it down, eventually it's going to explode out. That's probably a bad analogy, but that's kind of what it is. If you ignore the feelings forever, eventually they're going to come to the surface and they're going to force their way to the surface, and it's going to be at a time that you don't want. It's going to be a time that you don't expect, a time that's not convenient because you don't want to have breakdowns in front of people because you've been ignoring it. And so what I found is if I take time every so often to just let myself really feel the emotions, it helps. So to give an example, what I would do for the first week or two, it was almost daily, but I would go into a private place, bedroom, bathroom, somewhere where I could be alone, and I would, for me, I would use music, and there was a playlist of songs we had that reminded us of Liam, and I would sit and listen to that music. and just let myself remember everything. I would think about what had happened. I would think about the feelings I had when he passed, and inevitably I would break down and cry, and it hurt, and it was painful, and it was not a pleasant thing to do. I hated doing it. Every time I did it, I hated it because it hurt, and I didn't want to think about those things. But by forcing that, that allowed me to control when I have the breakdown, having it in a safe place. Because inevitably, after I've been sitting listening to this music for half an hour, or I've had a good cry, things like that, I leave and I'm ready to face the day again. And I'm ready to move on. I'm ready to do what I got to do. And then the next day, I'd have to do it again. And over time, it eventually reached a point where instead of every day, it started becoming once or twice a week, and then it became once a month. That's about where I'm at now. About once a month, I'll take some time and I'll just let myself really feel it and so forth. And it's allowed me to be able to be professional, do my work, and not have these crazy breakdowns. The one in particular that had happened in the classroom, that was a period where I had gotten really busy with stuff, and I was like trying to be super strong guy, and I was like, it's been a year and a half, 2 years, this shouldn't be bothering anymore. I should be moving on with my life. And so I ignored it for a while, and I just went through my day, did my thing, so forth, and I had that breakdown in the middle of the classroom, and that was the moment when I realized, okay, I got to get back to doing this, because if I don't, this is what happens, and I can't have this kind of stuff happening. And so it allowed me to take control over my own grieving. Um, it also is beneficial in a couple other ways. Number one, I think that uh, there's a guilt that comes into effect if you ignore it. Whether you realize it or not, there's kind of an inherent in your head guilt where if you're not being affected by what happened, it almost makes you feel like your son's death doesn't mean anything because now I can just move on and get on with the rest of my life, which is not the case. But that guilt plays in your mind if you're not. And so when you take those moments to really let yourself feel it, it reminds you that yes, this does affect me. And no, I'm not some heartless person that's forgotten my son and moved on. So that there's a benefit there. Number two, it allows you to go back to that moment and remember those emotions when they were really fresh. And that's not a pleasant thing to do, but I think it's an important thing to do because it allows you to like remember why it is that you've been affected the way that you've been affected. It allows you to kind of go back there. And when you go back there with more experience and more maturity, you can go back there and have a more healthy relationship with those emotions. I hope that made sense. But in a way, it allows me that the further away from this I get, the more healthy my interaction with those emotions can be. And so it doesn't have to be quite as painful as it was the previous time. And over time, you begin to, it kind of morphs. And now when I have those feelings and I'm crying and I'm thinking about him, things like that, it's not as painful because I also remember some of the happy moments. And it's become almost kind of a like moment of crying that I look forward to because it allows me to remember everything about my son, the good, the bad, and the ugly, and so forth. Um, and doing that uh, over time has helped with my healing. I think that if I weren't doing that, I would be in a much worse place than I currently am. Um, but the important thing to remember is that there is no timeline on healing. There just isn't. And people around you are going to think there is. They're going to think after a year or two, you should be good. Some might even think after 6 months, you should be good. And a good chunk of the time, you're going to look like you're good. And everybody's going to assume that you're good. But you're not. Um, and so if you know somebody that's going through this, understand that. Understand that 5 years later, they still think about it every single day. It affects them every single day. My whole life has changed because of what happened there. I am a better worker because of what I learned from that experience. I am a better friend because of what I learned from that experience. But I am also negatively affected on a daily basis because of what's there. You'll end up thinking about your son and being like, if he were still alive, what would he be like right now? Liam would be pulling up on his 5th birthday here in this next year, and so we would be starting to think about him going to school and things like that. And I think about that. What would it be like if he were still here? How would he interact with Silsby if he were still here? Um, what would they be like together? You think about those things all the time, and you don't always talk about them because people think you're a weirdo if you do, but you think about them. And when you have somebody you can talk to about them, you cling to those people. So those people that are okay talking with, what would life be like if my son were still here? I cling to those people. I need those people. I need to be able to talk to them and say, yeah, my son would be almost 5 right now. And I wonder what he'd be doing. This is what I think he'd be doing, and things like that. Um, because it affects you every day. It affects you the rest of your life. You never go back to the person you were prior to it happening. And that's probably the most important thing. The Jared Briggs that was here when he died, he's gone. It's a different Jared. Some ways better, some ways worse. I don't necessarily think it's a good or a bad thing. It's just I'm different. I'm not the same person I was back then. It has changed me forever. Um, Sometimes people talk about how long does it take before you get back to being your old self after something like this happens. You never do. You get to a close facsimile of your old self where you can function and people will think you're your old self, but you're never your old self again. It's just not. You're different. You can't have something like this happen and not be changed by it. That's my personal opinion, at least. And it's been true for my own life. I am not the same person that I was. There have been some pretty drastic changes. Some of which, as I go through this channel, you'll over time see me talk about the evolution of how I became that new person, because I am. Um, but more than anything, I think kind of to try to bring this down to something bite-sized that's easy to take, um, take time to grieve. Because if you don't make time to grieve, then you're going to grieve. You're just not going to get to choose when it happens. So if you make time to grieve, it allows you to pick the time when you're going to do that. Number 2, make sure that there are people you can talk to about your child, both about the happy memories from the past and about where they would be at now, because those are going to be things that you're going to want to talk about. And if you don't have somebody to talk about, you're going to feel really awkward and weird trying to bring it up to somebody who's not doesn't know that's what you need. And then number 3, don't be afraid of who you're becoming. Don't be scared to let yourself evolve, because you will. And it'll be for the better. There'll be some parts about it that probably you'll sit back and wish you could go back to the way things were, but you'll be a better person for it. So let yourself evolve. And then lastly, and this one's probably the toughest one, you've experienced something that very few people in this world experience. And when somebody experiences that, one of the toughest parts about experiencing this is there's so few people who actually know how you feel. And if you sit and you're silent and you don't talk about it, you don't let people know you experienced it, and nobody knows, then you can't help anybody. And yet, if you're open and you're vocal and you're willing to hear people out, there is going to be somebody else in your life you're going to meet who's going to go through the exact same thing, who's going to need a friend, who's going to need that person who can say, I've been there. I know exactly how you feel. And fortunately for me, I had that. But you got to be that person for somebody else. Once you've reached that happy medium where you're at peace with yourself, you got to be able to be that for somebody else. And I think I would say if there's anybody watching this right now that's going through that process and is like, hey, I don't know this Jared guy, but he seems like a good guy to talk to, send me a message. Send me a comment. Like, let me know. Because I'll be there for you. I know what it feels like. I know what you're going through, and I'm happy to be there for you. Because the reality is there's this family bond that's created between you and other people that experience this loss, where I don't even have to know the person. I'm immediately connected to them. Real quickly, and then I'll close the video. My sister had a really good friend who had a baby who was born premature, like 2 to 3 months premature. And there were so many complications that doctors were just convinced he wasn't going to, I think 3 separate occasions they said he's not going to make it through the night. I didn't know the woman. I didn't know her child. But when you hear about the potential of a baby dying, it triggers the emotions you felt when you lost your own child. And the last thing I would ever want is for somebody else to experience that. And so all of a sudden, I felt deeply connected to that child and deeply connected to that mother. And I just wanted to be whatever support I could be, because I knew that if she lost the child, she was going to need support. And if she didn't lose the child, it's still a scariest thing to go through. And miraculously, that baby ended up making it. He's now like 3 years old, and like you'd have no clue that he had all the complications that he did. But I don't have to meet your child to care and to feel emotionally invested in your child, because when you've lost a child, any child being lost affects you in a way that it didn't prior. It's just the way it is. So I guess what I'm saying there is, if there's anybody watching this video who's suffering through this alone, who doesn't have somebody to turn to, doesn't have somebody to support them, or doesn't have people to talk to about their child because everybody thinks they're a weirdo when they do it, connect with me. I can be that person for you. Um, Thanks again, everybody, and I'll be back later with another video.